Aloha and welcome to this brief screencast where I want to talk to you about using the assets mechanism in Meteor to load large amounts of data into your system. This can be done anytime, but I'm going to illustrate it at startup. So why do we want to load data from the assets file? Normally, if we go here, you can see the normal way that we load data that I've taught you is to add some data to the settings.development.json file. And then in the startup folder for the server in Mongo.js, for example, we have some code, and the code does things like says, well, if we don't find that there's any users in the database, then that probably means the database is empty. And so what we're going to do is we're going to extract some fields from the Meteor settings.development.json file, such as default projects, default profiles, which you can see here, default profiles, default projects, and then we'll map through the values, this array. This is an array of objects. We'll map through them and we'll call a function to add it to the system. That's how you've been seeing data loaded before. There's only one slight problem with this approach, and that is that this settings.development.json file is limited to 64,000 characters. Okay, that's kind of an OS level thing. It has to do with the fact that in some context settings.development.json is actually going to become an environment variable. Environment variables have a maximum length associated with them. And so you can see here we're on line 133. If this thing is 100 characters long, then we've used 13,000 characters. Obviously we've used a lot less because not all of these lines are 100 characters long, but you can see we're well below this 64,000 character limit. But then again, I mean, we've only loaded like a tiny bit of data. Okay, so if you're building a system which you want to initialize with 1,000 objects or 20,000 objects, whatever, right? Well, the settings file is not going to work for that. And so what I'm going to show you is a very, very simple alternative way to do it, which involves using the assets package in Meteor. And really all that means is that it provides you an easy way to access a directory that has to be called private inside the app folder. Okay, and the idea about this private directory is this private directory is not going to be accessible by your deployed application. Okay, unlike the public directory, which you might imagine is accessible to the public or to the deployed, to people who find the URL to these particular files. They can access them once the system's deployed. Private directory, no one can access that from the web-based interface, so that's a good thing. It means we can put stuff in here, it's private, okay, and access it through this assets capability or mechanism. And maybe the next thing to do is, let me go to find this assets page just to show you where it is. Okay, here's the assets documentation page, and there's some data in here you can look at, but to be honest, if you just look at this code in Bowfolios, it really pretty much shows you all you need to know, as long as what you store in there is a JSON file. So what I've done in this version of the system, or what I've done is I've gone into the settings.development JSON file, and I've set load assets file to be true. This defaults to false when you get your copy of Bowfolios. But because of the fact that this is set to true, something different is going to happen. And what is the different thing that's going to happen is that this code right here is going to be executed. And what this code says is, well, if load assets file, if that field is set to true, which now it is, okay, and we haven't already loaded it. This is kind of my simple check to see that the assets file hasn't been loaded, because if we load it twice, we'll get some errors because we're trying to redefine users. But anyway, so if we haven't loaded it before and we're supposed to be loading it, then I'll declare this variable called data.json, which happens to be the name of the file in this private directory. I'll print something out to say, hey, by the way, we're loading stuff. And then, it's really simple. You're going to take the name of this file, okay, data.json, which should correspond to a file or even a path down to a file in this private directory. But since this data.json is at the top level, we can just say assets.getText and then the name of the file, and that will load that file from that private directory. And then, in order to kind of make it easy to deal with, we'll call this json.parse on it, which will parse it as and return a JSON object, which we can then fool around with. And you can look at data.json and you can see it's not, a large file at all, but it could be. It could be very large. I guess as large as you want, really. But it contains exactly one profile for a colleague named Peter Leong, and it contains exactly one project. Okay. And so if we go back here, what happens is we go through the profiles, we map through them, defining, calling the add profile function with as many profiles as we have in this data.json, similar for projects, okay? Which is really just almost exactly like what we do with the regular settings file. We're doing the same thing, okay? Except we're getting it out of the settings.development file rather than the data.json file, okay? When everything's all done, we go to Bowfolios. What we can see now is that we now have a new profile for Peter Leong, and we have a new project, which is this Online project, and we have a new interest called online learning. All right, so the key things to think about when you're, if you want to load a lot of data into your Meteor application, more than 64,000 characters, what you're going to want to do is create a directory called private. You can store your data in that directory. There could be subdirectories, and in which case you just have a path, but you can just dump the file right in there. And then you call this JSON, and as long as it's a JSON file, which I recommend, then you just call JSON parse of assets.getText of the file name. Now you've got an object, and you can go to town with it. All the rest of this stuff is just kind of making it convenient in the case of Bowfolios to not have this thing happen unless you're actually specifically interested in it. All right, there you go. Assets and loading lots of data. Hope you enjoy it.